Remembering a Caretaker's Pain. Written by Short Storytelling. Read by Short Storytelling. This will not be an easy thing to read, but I assure you, it's not an easy thing to write either. We are a social species. It's forged into our very being to share our pain. Knowing someone else feels the same, it makes our load lighter. That's who I'm writing this for. Those silent caretakers and survivors, not the ones that passed away, but the ones left behind. My hope is that others can take solace from my pain, that those of you living in similar situations will know you're not alone, that the pain you feel and refuse to acknowledge, it's just as significant as those you're helping. By laying my experience bare, I'm hoping I can help you to share your load. I will pour myself into this, all of my guilt, my fear, my sadness, and my own pain, before too much time has passed and the edges are rounded off, and time has blessed me with forgetting. My wife and I met young. We married, we had children, we had ups and downs. This is not that story. Suffice to say, we had a loving family, if isolated to just us and our children. Our family was my wife, our daughter, our son, and myself. All of this begins in our mid-30s, my children teenagers. Life changes on a regular day. You go about your business, plan your dreams, and hope for the best. My wife had underlying health issues all her life. This was mostly illustrated by having regular migraines. I often hear people talk about having a migraine. They complain at work, standing in the sunlight, their hand on their forehead with their eyes open, expressing their discomfort. I don't mean to diminish their pain, but that was never how I saw migraines. When my wife would have a migraine, she would be laid low, sometimes for days. She needed the dark, as the light sensitivity was extreme. Even just turning on the bedroom light with her eyes closed would induce so much pain she would run to the bathroom to vomit. The pain was constant, a searing, pounding pressure, usually behind one of her eyes and flowing over her head. She would be unable to eat and barely able to drink other than to put something in her stomach to make the dry heaving stop. This was something she experienced for as long as I had known her. Her migraines would last for days. Normally, after 3 days, she would be so exhausted on the edge of dehydration, I would finally be able to convince her to go to the ER. They would take steps, give her an injection and fluids, and then her migraine would finally subside. I only remember having to go to the ER a handful of times for migraines, not because she didn't need it, but because she was stubborn. Most of her migraines would last for a day or two. We learned to take steps to improve things. I would remind her to eat and drink, hopefully to stave off the migraine, or offer a back rub to try to help her relax enough to let the headache subside. We covered the windows in the bedroom, making it completely dark inside. The rest of our house's windows covered so that she could come out into the house and not risk the migraine rebounding from the light. Typically, she had a migraine once a week, a bad one lasting more than a day, maybe once a month. I would say they were cyclical, but we never found a pattern. She would go through times where she might have bad migraines once a week, and other times when she might go a couple of months without any. My routine was to take care of the kids and play interference, to teach them it was normal to live like this. Mama just gets headaches and needs to lay down. When they were younger, I remember having to take time off work so I could care for the kids. We became desensitized to it all. It was just a normal thing. The initial panic I might have had when we were together, dulled by years of experiencing it, my own empathy suppressed out of a sense of survival. I didn't understand at the time the guilt I felt, or the anger. What I knew is that she was in pain that I couldn't fix. I didn't realize how much it hurt me too, to see her suffering chronically and be unable to help. As much as I wish this was all there was to the tale, it was only a taste of things to come. Caretaker guilt can be insidious. Being unable to find a cause for the person you care for being sick, at some point, you begin to wonder if it's you. The normalization of the illness makes you wonder if you're special in some way since you don't have the same pain. You question everything. Is it happening because of something you're not doing for them? Maybe it's spiritual. Maybe they're being punished karmically for some misdeed, or maybe you are and it's causing their pain. Unable to understand or even talk about the guilt, you begin to get angry. You get frustrated at having to miss out on events because they're sick, watching helplessly as someone you love is in pain and being unable to relieve that pain. It takes a toll. Their physical pain causes emotional pain in everyone around them. It's a vicious cycle. They hurt, you get angry about it, then you feel guilty about feeling angry. Wash, rinse, repeat. After years of this, I became acclimated. It became less about caregiving and more about giving her space when she was, quote, sick. I would check on her, see to her needs, but mostly just leave her be in the dark. Even now, recalling this, it makes my heart hurt. To think I could leave someone I love alone in the dark, but it was what our life was like, and we both dealt with it as best as we could. In our mid-30s, things changed somewhat. She had a hysterectomy due to another health issue she had. This changed her body chemistry, and thankfully, blissfully, her migraines became less and less common. We began to plan for the future, and she hoped to study and find a career. This lasted for about a year. She had an umbilical hernia as a child. It had been repaired, but not very well. She had 3 different laparoscopic surgeries since then that further weakened the muscle wall around her belly button. After her hysterectomy, the hernia had returned. Eventually, it became incarcerated. A hernia is where part of your inner tissues poke through the hole in your muscle wall. When it becomes incarcerated, it's pinched, and the blood flow is cut off. If this happens for long enough, the pinched tissue dies and becomes infected. Untreated, this leads to sepsis, an infection in the blood, organ failure, and death. She'd been complaining about her hernia for a few days, but was stubborn about it. She didn't want to see anyone about it. Once it was swollen and hot to the touch, she knew she didn't have a choice. We took her to the ER. They did their scans and confirmed the diagnosis. She needed emergency surgery. This was new. Surgery is scary. I recall years before, after the birth of our daughter, she had emergency surgery as well. The pregnancy had given her gallstones, more painful than giving birth, she had said. She finally agreed to go to the ER when she'd been writhing in pain for several hours and couldn't take it anymore. It was scary then, but not in an imminent death sort of way. It was scary, hoping it would fix the issue and the pain would stop. In that instance, it did. This time, the surgery was to prevent death. The tissue was infected, but not septic. The doctor assured us it was routine and that she would be fine afterwards. I remember the fear I had. She was gone into surgery, and I was left alone. We had friends taking care of our kids. That was the first time being afraid she could die. I wondered how I would go on, if I could be a single parent, how I could help my kids cope, how different our lives would be. I sat in that waiting room alone, stewing in my fear, no one with me, no words of hope. This is where survivor's guilt takes root. Harry, I am worried for myself when my wife is under the knife and risking her life. I don't have a clear memory of how long the surgery took. I just remember that it went well, and she was expected to make a full recovery. We returned home and prepared to move on with our lives. A few days later, we were worried. Her incision didn't look right. We took a trip back to see the surgeon and have him look at it. He was out on vacation, but his nurse examined my wife and was adamant everything was fine, nothing to worry about. 7 days after the surgery, we were back in the ER at a different hospital, and she was going back into emergency surgery. Her previous repair had become infected, and the tissue was dead. She was of immediate danger of going into sepsis. For the second time in a week, I found myself alone, afraid, and waiting. This time took longer, as it was not a routine procedure. That fear was more profound this time. No care had been taken to assure either of us she would be okay. They had advised us they would need to see how bad it was when they opened her up. This is a different kind of fear. It numbs you, and your brain stops working. Suddenly, the idea of her dying was more palpable. It feels like ice water in your veins. Your body is hypersensitive. Even small sounds trigger a tremor and making you jump. But you endure, because you're not the one doing the scary part. If you ever have a friend waiting in a situation like that, don't leave them alone. Ground them. Hold their hand. Stay with them. And help them understand their fear. The kind of trauma that remains from being alone like that can do serious damage, especially depending on the outcome. Be a rock for them and don't listen when they say they're okay. Just be there for them. The surgery was a success, but that's where things truly began for me as a caretaker. The necrotic tissue had to be excised, and this left her with an open wound in her belly. Her belly button and a large amount of muscle underneath had been removed. This would have to be packed, cleaned, and covered daily while it healed from the outside in, and this was not something she could do for herself, as she couldn't effectively see the wound to take care of it. It's worth noting that I had always been a squeamish person. Up until this point, I was afraid of needles. I didn't faint at the sight of blood, but it made me very uncomfortable and nearly nauseous. Caretaking was not something that came naturally to me, but I stepped up for the person I loved. I helped her through those 3 months, cleaning and packing her wound, looking close for infection, helping her adjust to her new condition. You'd be surprised how often you use your abdominal muscles without even thinking about it. Just sitting can be difficult without them, let alone standing up or walking. She stubborned her way through it, though, and made a full recovery. After a year, the wound fully healed, and the tissue beneath as well. She was back to her old self. That was when we needed the next surgery. The last one had been to undo the infected hernia repair. Once it healed, we still needed to go back in, remove the scar tissue, and do a permanent repair on the hernia to prevent it from happening again. The waiting wasn't as scary this time, no worry of immediate death. The procedure done, this repair was again left as an open wound, needing to be packed, cleaned, and covered again. My wife was never one to heal well. It took her body a long time to heal and always left excessive scars. 3 months later, this time was no different. Now left with a mass of scar tissue in her belly instead of muscle, she did her best to cope. She tried to live like she had before, but this was the start of her chronic pain. Chronic pain is about the worst thing that can be done to a person. It often isn't from something obvious like a broken arm, and it has no ending in sight. You feel pain, and that is just your life now. I'm not suggesting that chronic pain is worse for the caregiver, but it takes a toll on everyone around the victim. There are many resources for those experiencing chronic pain, groups to meet with, counseling to receive, books to read. I'm sure there is for caretakers as well, but it was something I denied myself. My wife denied herself of her own resources, and as a result, we clung to and supported each other. Our dreams for the future were gone now. Everything became about pain management. But death, by degrees, is what I call it. Our relationship deepened. We grew closer as we began exploring our new life together. It took time for the pain to take its measure of her. While she became physically unable to do things, I picked up the slack for her. This was not without a cost. Gradually, I had to take care of everything. Cleaning, washing, cooking. It was all on me. This wasn't something I was used to, and it created a lot of conflict for us. It wasn't that she didn't want to help, but she couldn't. It was something I became resentful of. It was difficult for me to deny the way I felt, but I had to. I couldn't talk to her about it without making her feel guilty and just giving her more pain. I denied my emotions, and I did my best to continue on. Physically, she was able to care for herself, just not anyone else. Sometimes she needed help getting up, but mostly she got around just fine using a cane. Stairs were a problem, and we lived in a third-floor apartment. This meant she didn't go out much, other than for doctor's appointments. Even riding in a car was painful for her. We learned to cope by staying home and spending time together. Over the years, we tried to find solutions, but there weren't any. Her propensity to get an infection and heal badly made her a poor candidate for many potential solutions. Each time we found something to investigate, we learned to quash any hopefulness as it became harder to accept each time it slipped away from us. The only solution we found to make life tolerable on a day-to-day basis was pain medication. Long-term, those medications take a severe price on a body. After a decade of using them, her body began declining further. She needed more and more of them to kill the pain as her body became more used to them. Her balance became worse and worse. She began falling regularly. Not bad falls, but bad enough that they were a concern. I don't know how long it was getting worse as it became so normal for her she stopped telling me when it happened. Her digestive system began breaking down. She developed Crohn's disease. It became routine for her to spend a few days in the hospital a couple of times a year. She also developed diabetes. This eventually led to the most damaging condition she had. When you have diabetes, it's not uncommon to develop neuropathy. This usually results in a loss of feeling in your hands or feet. Occasionally, it goes in a different direction. She had cardioautonomic neuropathy. What this meant is that her body had a difficult time regulating her blood pressure. This would result in her blood pressure crashing at random times. At the worst, the lowest reading I remember seeing was 60/40. As a reminder, 120/80 is considered normal. When it would become that low, it wasn't uncommon for her to lose consciousness. This is where I became a substantial caretaker for her. At the time I was working out of our home, I came home one night to find her crying on the floor in our kitchen. She'd walked into the kitchen to throw something away, then passed out when she turned around. In the fall, she broke her ankle. That was the first time I ended up calling an ambulance for her. Unable to get out of the house due to our steps, we had a ramp installed for her so stairs wouldn't be an issue. I did everything I could to encourage her. We got a wheelchair and took her out shopping. I wanted her to find what happy she could. I tried to get her into crafting, making sure she had a creative outlet. I made sure she had access to the movies and TV she wanted to watch. I tried making sure she had the food she enjoyed. We eventually were able to plan trips out about once a week. She would need a day to recover afterwards, but we weren't quite so housebound. At this point, caring for her had become my focus, my identity. Her blood pressure issues continued to get worse. She got up one night to use the restroom and passed out before she got there. Being sleepy, she wasn't able to assess herself and even know if her blood pressure was low. She would stand up, take a few steps, then faint. These were bad falls. She'd often hit her head. The fix for this was for me to get up with her. Any time she got up, I would go with her. I'd keep my hand on her shoulder, keep her moving, and help her get to the potty. I know she hated it, but she also needed the help. Every time she would get up, I would worry she might die. I'd lie in bed waiting, hoping she'd return safely. One night I recall waiting in bed for her, then hearing a thumping sound on the wall. Unresponsive to my knocks on the door, I opened it and found her still sitting on the potty, her eyes hooded and glazed over, rocking back and forth, knocking her head against the wall, so close to slipping out of consciousness that she didn't even respond to me, her eyes unseeing. After that, I walked with her every time. I'd get angry if she tried to get up without me, my fear palpable. I remember sitting in the other room in a chair, then hearing her walking in the hall and panicking, worried she'd fall on her own. I'd jump out of my chair and then make sure she was okay. When she'd go, I'd wait in the hall outside the door, knocking occasionally to ask if she was okay. Another bad night, waiting in the hall for her, I heard a crash. She'd tried to get up on her own, then fallen into the bathtub. We didn't know it at the time, but she fractured her spine that time. My son had to come and help to get her up out of the tub and back into bed. She just complained that her back hurt for a couple of days. I developed a hypervigilance. Any sound would make me wonder if she was up and walking on her own. She would often be too sleepy or have too low blood pressure to be properly conscious and try to get up on her own. I still feel my body tighten at the memories. The intimacy of our relationship was also difficult. I personally have a complicated relationship with sex, due to the point that I even began trying to lower my testosterone in an effort to lower my sex drive. The issue with this was that it wasn't a physical problem. Human touch is a basic need, and having a wife with chronic pain exacerbated by any movement made this difficult. I know she did her best, but she was so focused on dealing with pain she didn't have any resources left to help me deal with my emotional needs. Trying to have any sort of satisfying sex is difficult without movement. I knew that it would cause her pain, but it was still a need of my body and mind. Eventually, frustrated without a solution, she confided in me that she had no desire for sex with me, that she only allowed me to use her because she recognized how much I needed it. I know that her intent was to acknowledge her position and that she still wanted to be with me. As an empathetic person, this cut me deep. Knowing that my needs were actively hurting her and that the person I loved had no desire for me crushed me. It became something I hated about myself, and it filled me with even more guilt and shame. I would find myself reaching for her, filled with need, not just for release, but for intimacy, and then I would lay in the dark, hating myself for it afterwards. She tried offering suggestions, even suggesting that we have an open marriage. Already filled with loathing for myself, this was not something I could consider. I've never been able to separate love and sex, and I knew being with someone else would lead to the end of our marriage, and I could not do that to her. I couldn't face the idea of causing her even more pain, so I did my best to deny my needs and convince myself I was okay. I loved her, and she loved me, and that was supposed to be enough. I lied to myself that it was. The less intimacy we had, the more I craved it. We want what we can't have. I did my best to suppress those feelings, but it led to feeling like I was in a loveless marriage. There were times I hated her, that I felt trapped. My relationship had become a job I hadn't signed up for. I was left feeling alone in my marriage and guilty for feeling that way. It wasn't the physical intimacy I needed as much as I needed the emotional aspect of it, to be accepted and loved for my needs, not tolerated and allowed like I was. Eventually, the medication she took for her diabetes also began to have problems. I lost count of how many times she ended up in the hospital that year. Her body would go into ketoacidosis due to her diabetes medication. This made her muscles weak and unresponsive. The first time she had fallen, but she lacked the strength in her legs to get off the floor. That was another ambulance call. The paramedics lifted her off the floor and into her wheelchair to go to the hospital. Another night, I helped her get to the potty, but her legs lacked the strength to stand long enough to get into her wheelchair. Again, the paramedics helped her get into her chair and go to the hospital. Eventually, we stopped trying to get her to the potty. We got a commode to go next to the bed. We both hated it. She hated using it, and I hated cleaning it, but it was necessary. Things continued to get bad. I would still get up to help her use the commode. Sometimes even that was too much. I remember her passing out on the commode several times. Each time I worried she broke even more. I wasn't just worried about the falls even more. Even just passing out was causing damage. When your blood pressure goes that low, you pass out from lack of oxygen in the brain. Each time, that means your brain is starving, and each time, it causes more damage. Every time I wondered if it would take another ambulance call. Every time I wondered if she'd wake up this time. Kneeling next to her, knowing what was happening, watching her eyes roll back, then her body slump, having to hold her up, make sure she didn't fall off the commode, waiting for her body to inhale that giant breath, the breathing, mechanical and fully automatic, and then watching the flickering light in her eyes slowly shimmer back into consciousness. Even this eventually became routine. That last year or two we held on to each other, and I felt my own spirit dying. I hated everything about my life now. I felt trapped. I knew my only escape would be when she passed, and I hated myself for even thinking that. I wasn't even aware of how severe my own depression had become. I was so focused on her, I didn't have any resources left to worry about myself. I just accepted this was my life and began a plan to end it. I knew that her condition was bad enough that she needed to be in a home, but I couldn't convince her of that. It just hurt to talk to her about her condition. I didn't want her to think I didn't love her, that I wanted to send her away. I could never leave her, and somehow my own PTSD-filled mind felt the only answer was to be done myself. I knew she would end up in a home then and get the care that she needed. I hated everything about this. I was angry at myself for thinking it. I was angry with her for being sick. I was guilty for feeling broken myself. I was guilty for letting her down. I felt guilty for thinking this and knowing I couldn't talk to her about it. I couldn't let her see how bad off I was because it would only make her feel worse. My life became about fear, anger, guilt, and shame. I never acted on my plan. Somehow just having one was a comfort and gave me the resolve to keep going. The last week, it was bad. She was out of her pain medication. Given her poor mental state, it wasn't uncommon for her to mess up her meds. This often resulted in her being short for the month. This time it would be 4 days without medication. That would be long enough for the pain to settle in and for withdrawal to fully kick in. After the second day, she had used the commode and been too weak to get back into bed. Her efforts resulted in her being on the floor next to the bed. Being exhausted and needing to work the next day, I got her some blankets and a pillow and made her as comfortable as I could. She slept on the hardwood floor that night, and I slept in our bed alone. I laid in bed that night alone, hating myself for being okay with all this, and that it was all normal now. Fear of losing her, angry at her condition, guilty about being angry with her, and full of shame for all of my feelings, I drifted to sleep. The next day, her strength had returned. I helped her back into bed. It was an uneventful day. We slept together that night, and I awoke and began doing my remote work job. About 15 minutes after my shift started, there was a crash in the bedroom. She hadn't tried to get up. She was too weak, but she had managed to fall out of the bed. She'd hit her head as she fell. and she was coherent enough to be frustrated and confused about what happened. I remember being angry. I had to work and couldn't spend the time needed to take care of her. She flailed slightly, trying to sit up and lacking strength. In a cranky voice, I let her know that she would need to just stay on the floor until later. I got her blankets and a pillow and got her settled on the floor again while I went back to work. I checked on her again in about 30 minutes. She was sleeping, her chest moving up and down normally. Again, I went back to work. And I'm not sure why, but I decided to check on her again about 15 minutes later. It was 7:15 a.m. I couldn't see her breathing. I opened the door wider and remember seeing her feet. The skin looked odd and mottled. I called her name, but she didn't respond. I shook her, and she didn't respond. That was the last time I called an ambulance for her. That morning, I lost my identity. I had spent the last 15 years being her caretaker, and it was gone, all at once. I'm not going to talk about the guilt of that morning, wondering if I'd done something or caused it to happen. That's the typical sort of survivor's guilt. What's more significant is the guilt of being glad it was over. I'm not glad she's gone, but I am glad her pain is over. There are times at night in the darkness when the shame of feeling like I have my life back hits me. The guilt that she had to die for me to live again, that's what I couldn't prepare for. That constant fear, the PTSD, is mostly gone now. The anger of her condition is gone. Even the guilt and shame have subsided, having become routine. Instead, I'm just hollow and empty. That emptiness, it feeds the loneliness. Feeling my empty bed, how cold my sheets are, that loneliness grips me and lays me bare. My life was about her illness, and now it was gone. Without an identity of my own, who am I now? I've spent the last several months learning to live again. Initially, that meant being on my own. I groped and flailed for anything I could find for myself. I spent way more money than I should have on distractions, desperate for some solace, but unable to distract myself. My emptiness was a constant in my mind. Eventually, I learned that the only path to find myself was to find others. I reached out to people online, tried to get myself into the world and meet people. I began learning who I was. More importantly, I began to decide who I wanted to be. I can't change what happened. I know I'm not to blame for her condition or her passing. I spent 30 years loving her, and that doesn't just go away. I'm honestly comforted knowing her pain is over, that it no longer can define who she is. I started this thinking I needed to focus on what happened, to try to remember that pain. Now I think I'd rather focus on my own future, and choosing who I want to be on my own terms.